All right. Good evening, everyone, or good morning if you're tuning in to us from Australia. And we are so excited for you to be here tonight. We've been looking forward to this event. So I want to welcome you to our collaborative event, The Power of Relationships in Social Emotional Learning and Racial Equity. And this event is co-hosted by the Zones of Regulation and the Innocent Classroom, and we have special guest, Principal Jones, joining us here tonight. So I want to welcome everyone. We have quite a few people still signing in and joining us on Facebook Live. So we are going to go through some housekeeping items, and I'm going to introduce our panelists before we really launch in tonight. I want to give a special shout out to all of our teachers out there. This is Teacher Appreciation Week, and boy, do we appreciate you now more than ever before. We know it's been a really tough year, and just know that we value the work you do so much, and none of this is possible without you. So hopefully you have a whole team of people appreciating you this week the way that we are. So thank you so much. My name is Emily Walls. I'm a trainer and a implementation specialist for the Zones of Regulation, and I will be your moderator this evening. A few quick housekeeping items. First of all, we encourage you to have your camera on if you feel comfortable so that we can all be in community together. All attendees will be muted just because we will have a large group here today. And so we do encourage you to use the chat feature as your way to be in community with us. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can use the comment feature, and we will be monitoring both of those just for questions and to pick out some overall themes from our conversation. Feel free to introduce yourself and where you're from so that we can kind of get our community up and running this evening. And obviously, feel free to hide the chat if it's distracting, and take care of your own needs. And like Leah said earlier, we will be having replay available after the event this evening. So if you want to tune back in, or if you have missed a portion here and there, just keep tuned in. We will get it to you, we promise. So I have the privilege today of introducing our three panelists. They are all here in Minnesota in the Twin Cities area. And we're just really lucky to have this group of special individuals tonight. I want to start by introducing Julian Conde, and I hope you can see him right up here on your screen.
Hello.
Leah, would you mind taking the share screen off so we can see our panelists? All right. Hi, Julian. Julian is the Associate Vice President and Program Trainer for the Innocent Classroom. He works with schools and districts all over the US to prepare for Innocent Classroom workshops, and he's involved in the quality and effectiveness of the Innocent Classroom programs. I'm going to read this portion because I really love the way this sentence was written. As a trainer, Julian has helped educators across the US to improve relationships with their students, improving academic and social outcomes for children of color and marginalized students. So we welcome you, Julian. Thank you.
Thank you.
We also are lucky to have Principal Chreese Jones here with us. Principal Jones has spent 25 years serving staff, scholars, and families in St. Paul Public Schools as a teacher, assistant principal, and now principal. She has had experience of over 3 years of collaboration with Innocent Classroom programming, as well as working with the Zones of Regulation school-wide. Principal Jones is also heavily engaged in racial equity work in consulting, presenting, teaching, leading professional development for post-secondary education students. And she happens to also be the principal vocalist and veteran member of the Grammy Award-winning Sounds of Blackness musical ensemble, and is a vocal performer. So we welcome Principal Jones to our discussion tonight.
Good evening, glad to be here.
Thank you. Also, if you are so inclined, there's a wonderful TED Talk called Remembering Your Why, delivered by Principal Jones if you are looking for a little inspiration after our event this evening. And lastly, we have Leah Kuypers, who's the creator and author of the Zones of Regulation Framework and Curriculum, which is a social emotional learning curriculum with a global following. Leah is an occupational therapist and autism specialist with over 15 years in school-based and clinical settings, working with students with unique needs. Leah has trained thousands of teachers and trains thousands of teachers and practitioners every year to make a difference in children's lives, and is the author of new supplementary Zones resources, the Zones storybook series and tools to try cards for kids, teens, and tweens. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you. So excited.
All right, you also have a team of Innocent Classroom and Zones of Regulation staff here tonight that you may be hearing from throughout our discussion. So without further ado, we're going to start this evening by giving you a quick overview of the Zones and Innocent Classroom. And I'm going to hand it off to Leah Kuypers. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. It is so exciting to be with you this evening, and I am just feeling so energized by pulling together Julian Conde and Principal Jones with me tonight to share with you our passions and hope to give you some inspiration on steps you can take tomorrow in improving the climate and the experience for all of our learners in our classrooms. So for those of you who are coming to us without the familiarity of the Zones of Regulation, I'm going to give a down and dirty nuts and bolts little snippet here. So the Zones of Regulation is a framework. So with this curriculum, it's a book with 18 lessons, and we're teaching in a compassionate way to think about all the different ways we feel, our states of alertness, our energy, and categorize them into these 4 colored zones. And in doing so, we create this pathway to approach regulation and have common language between teachers, caregivers, and our learners. It provides a visual structure to help us with the co-regulation for the expression of how we're feeling, to use nonverbals, indicate with visual supports, and it gives us the system then to allow us to pair our regulation tools and strategies with each of our zones to support finding adaptive and healthy ways to manage these sets of feelings. So this is just overall of what these 4 zones entail, ranging from these different emotional groups, with the blue zone being our lower states of alertness, up to the red zone where we have big, strong, intense feelings that can be really overwhelming in nature. But with the zones, we talk about all the zones are on the inside. It's based on what are we feeling, not how we're behaving. We talk about all these feelings are expected. We have a whole rainbow of feelings, and those are all okay feelings to have. And therefore, all of our zones are okay. There's no good zone. There's no bad zone. What we're really working to help individuals understand is that we have a way to think about building this awareness of how we're feeling. And when we are able then to recognize what zone we're in, we start putting our tools in place to explore regulating that zone. And so our tools for the blue zone, when we're in those lower states of alertness, end up looking usually different than, say, the tools for that yellow zone when we're starting to get a little more elevated in our emotional state, our energy is increased. So this is how the system works out and how these visual supports can really help provide an individualized experience for each of our learners to be authentically themselves, allow them all their feelings, and find them the tools to support regulating in healthy, adaptive ways. So as we get back to these principles, I want you to take away that all the zones are okay. And one way that we talk about supporting our learners is by modeling that ourselves, that we really go through this process with them. As adults, we have all these feelings too. And so we can be transparent and set the climate to support their regulation by being more forthcoming with what efforts we're putting into this. So right now I'm excited. I'm in the yellow zone. And this morning I was tired in the blue zone. So we talk about how we move through the zones and really try to build this climate that we are allowed to have our feelings, and we're all working together on finding our strategies to support that, allowing for individualized supports for each learner and what's going to work for them. And that is really what led me to the innocent classroom. When I train on the zones of regulation, one of the precursors I talk about, if we want to make the zone successful, we need to pause on our implementation of the curriculum and first look at the climate of the classroom. Let's think about the environment in which we're going to be overlaying this resource. And this isn't going to be successful if we have inequities in that classroom, if we have different approaches to different students of different races. We know in our education system, our students of color are disproportionately referred to special ed services. They are disproportionately subjected to punitive measures, and we have achievement gaps in our academics. And so we really need to be digging in as teachers, practitioners, caregivers, and examining our practices, thinking about what we can be doing to make an environment that is going to allow this social emotional work to be receptive. And I believe that boils down to relationships as one of those fundamental factors. And so when I found the Innocent Classrooms training, and Emily and I went and sat in on a training last year, I was just blown away by the simplicity of their message. This is something we can all be doing tomorrow, looking for the innocence in each child. And I feel this is going to set this child up for success, as well as all this other social, emotional, and academic work we need to be layering on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julian Conde, who can talk to you more about the Innocent Classroom.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leah. And thank you all for joining us here tonight. This is really, really exciting. Just come to this conversation with so much gratitude. Thank you, Leah and Emily and everyone at Zones of Regulation for inviting Innocent Classroom to be a part of this conversation and allowing me a little bit of time to share what it is we do, how we think about all of this, and ultimately how we intersect with social and emotional learning and equity work and all of the very, very complex and important things that are happening in all of our schools, and how we approach all of this from a pretty unique standpoint that ultimately has relationships in the center. So thrilled to be here and share a little bit about who Innocent Classroom is. Go ahead. Leah's kind of controlling my deck, so we're going to work together on that. Thank you. So we jump into it really. Innocent Classroom comes from this really simple idea. We know children learn better from people they believe care about them. So we start from, and Leah said it, it's a simple idea, but the ways that we demonstrate that belief of care is where the complexity really comes in. So Innocent Classroom has to be a child-specific response to our diverse classrooms that we're all working in, that we're all navigating, and we're all trying to figure out the best possible ways of addressing all of our students. And ultimately, we address teachers to a relationship building process that ultimately dismantles the racial bias and all of the things that are creating distance between some of our children, particularly our children of color, our Black and brown children in America, from their educational experiences. Go ahead. So the Innocent Classroom ultimately is about restoring relationships. We know we talk about all of the issues that are happening in education with a lot of language that can be damning at times, like conversations of achievement gap and all of that thing that happens. And for a long time, Innocent Classroom, we've been talking about it as a relationship gap, where some of our children do not have the same relationships as relates to educations and educators as others. And we know that that is the place that we have some power. So the Innocent Classroom is ultimately about authentic relationships that connect each and every individual child to their special and unlimited potential. And I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into what we really mean by that, but our concept of the good. So really, we think about freeing children to achieve. Not that our kids, particularly our Black and Indigenous and brown children in America, they're not broken and need to be fixed. But the way our system is operating and the way it continues to operate, if we're not careful, if we try to stay in this neutral space, if we're not being super intentional about what we do for our kids in our spaces, the system will continue to hurt them. And we ultimately start to see it as the system puts shackles on our kids, shackles on what is possible and how far they can go in this educational journey if we don't intentionally free them from that. So we think about every single educator as those liberators to some degree. And through this Innocent Classroom framework, we ultimately want to take away the weight of society's expectations for our Black children, for our Indigenous children, for all of our children who come from historically marginalized spaces, or our children who come with us from different, with different narratives that are connected directly to who they are, but also oftentimes don't at all capture their humanity. Go ahead. So I like to always share this commitment. This is what we do. This is like who we are from our personal space, that if we're going to work with any school, any environment, we've come with this belief and commitment that every single child deserves to feel innocent. Innocent as we define it, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time to make sure we can really understand what we're talking about, which is ultimately a freedom from racialized narratives, racialized expectations, all of the negative influences that have happened over generations and generations of racializing our kids. And also the generations and generations of just building narratives about who gets to be successful in our spaces, what success looks like for some, and what ultimately is normal and what is a learner. All of those things end up keeping our children away from us. And we know that the research around this really validates what we're talking about. Go ahead, Leah. So I wanted to share this question as a way to kind of dive into what Innocent Classroom ultimately does. Because it's not enough to just say that there's narratives that are telling us who we are. It's not enough to just say that stereotypes are bad. We start every single conversation with a group of educators by asking them this question. And if you're being honest, a hard question. But it's also one that the answers come pretty quickly. And we're not leading about it. We just ask, what is it that our society is telling us about the children that you go to school every day trying to reach, about the kids that you go and you think about the best possible way to teach them math, English, or maybe social and emotional learning skills? What is the narrative about those children that you are going to work for or going to work alongside? So we ask this question and we get a very, very predictable answer. And Leah, hang on. Okay, it's there. I always like to give a warning that I was about to show you a response, but here it is. No, it's good. Go back to there. I want to show you all the answer to this question. Perfect. And the only reason why I was being a little cagey about it is because I wanted to give a very direct warning that you're about to see an ugly list of stereotypes. But we always think it's important to not be theoretical here, because it's not a theoretical impact that's happening on the kids and our families that we care so much about. So we asked that simple question of what does society tell us about children of color in America? And we get a list like this. This list came from a group of educators actually that I talked to earlier this year. It's a predictable list, and no matter where we are in the nation, after working with close to 10,000 educators now, the list is predictable. And that all that tells us is that there's a predictable narrative about what it means to be a child of color in America. And we know that this is ultimately what we mean by guilt. This is in the way of a child's ability to be free in certain spaces. Because the research around stereotype threat and stereotype consciousness tells us if we know a narrative exists about our identities, we're forced to do something about that narrative. So when you're a small child and you know people think you're bad or angry or not very smart, you're forced to do something about that story about you. Whether it's, I'm gonna prove you wrong, watch how hard I can work. Or maybe it's, oh, you think I'm bad? I'll show you bad. What we mean by guilt is that no one child is guilty of this stuff, but they've been defined before they ever got to us, and they think we see them a certain way if we're not careful. And we know so much of what it means to be in special education ends up on this very list, and it has its own unique list of guilts too. And all of that impacts the humanity of the individual child who's trying to navigate our spaces. So this is what we mean by guilt. And our job in the Innocent Classroom and what we work through in every space that we go to is how do we make sure this stuff doesn't live within the relationships that we have with individual kids? Because the only way that we can have a systemic change like this, because this is big and heavy, all of this circling around every single child of color in different ways. So the only way that we can start to have a systemic change is by doing something individually, one educator and one child at a time. But we can start to do that and start to impact a whole space with educators dedicated to just that. Okay, Leah, you can go to the next. So we like to really think about it as an answer to this life-limiting, even life-threatening problems that are facing American public education. And that answer is the restoration and maintenance of innocence in our marginalized children. Because right now, the opposite of that experience of innocence, this feeling of guilt, is the primary barrier for children of color in our classrooms. And I know that's a really loaded statement because we know that there's so many barriers in our classrooms for kids of color. We know that. But when we think about what's impacting one educator at a time to do something different for one child, it's the weight of that narrative in front of them before they even get closer to that child. So we know that this becomes our primary barrier for one educator at a time to just give a different experience. Okay. So I wanted to kind of end with this image because it can be so heavy to just talk about this experience of guilt. And we are the Innocent Class, and we're actually a very positive program, and we actually really head towards this space of the good because we believe in actionable outcomes that we can do immediately to start to free up our kids of this experience. So I wanted to show this image, and bear with me, but this outer ring, the blue, this is what we say we oftentimes see. From some of our children, particularly our children of color, we see behaviors that can look angry or apathetic or sullen or even clownish or unresponsive. But we know because of all of the research around stereotypes and all the research around the impact of these narratives in our spaces, we see these behaviors because of this red ring. That ring comes from that question of what does society tell you about children of color? So what we see is the violence, the argumentative, the apathetic. It's because our kids have been told over and over that they don't speak good enough English, that they're aggressive, they're loud, they're illegal. So yeah, it becomes really intuitive to start to look and show up these ways. But underneath all of it, and what we ultimately guide every educator to think about and to build relationships upon, is the center, which we call the good. And it's not what our kids are good at or what's good about them, but it really truly is that for which all else is done. It's an Aristotelian concept. I'm not going to go too deep into it because that could take all of our time. But what I really mean is every single human being is driven by something that's core to their humanity. And if we figure out what that is, then we can empathize differently and build a relationship that shows our demonstration of knowledge of humanity. So when we know someone is looking to feel a sense of cared for, even if their way of getting it or navigating their cared for looks like telling you to F off or never doing work or throwing papers when you ask them to sit down, if you know that they need to be cared for, you're gonna have a different response to all those behaviors that we're working on changing. It's not that we put up with certain behaviors, but we have a different response when we know the good that's driving it. And it makes sure that we're never responding to that guilty narrative. So that's the really quick snapshot of what Innocent Classroom is, and also how we can begin to do something immediately in our spaces for this. So I'm really, really excited now to pivot and introduce you all to Principal Jones, who I'm always so inspired by, but I've had the privilege of working with directly for all 3 years that we did Innocent Classroom while Principal Jones was working at the Heights, and watching her commitment to both equity, but also having a concrete driven response to what that even means in our spaces and a real direct vision of what that means for the humans that we're talking about. It's truly inspiring, because as a leader, we can get lost in all the things that we're managing, but Principal Jones always brings it back to children. And I'm really excited to share, because she also has a deep knowledge of what zones of regulation is all about as well. So allow me to please introduce you all to Principal Jones.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm going to tell you, I'm a crier. I'm a passionate crier, and just to hear and revisit all the things, it just, my experience with both zones of regulation and Innocent Classroom has been a very rewarding benefit in my career as a building leader. And I know that it has touched the lives of many, many children. And I think about children has always been in the heart and the center of all the decisions that I make, and that governs me and guides me in what I want to put in front of them. And that is qualified educators that see them as children, that really are committed to seeing the innocence of them. I think I'm reminded that we often say relationships. I remember someone saying, we always talk about relationships, but I had to remind them or share with them that relationships have different levels. Relationships have different levels, and there's a different level of relationship that Innocent Classroom introduces as more of knowing it's more than knowing someone's name. It's more than knowing that their favorite color is red, though my color happens to be red. I love red. But it's a start. It's definitely a start, but it's definitely much deeper than that. And it's an investment that, if committed, produces the richest dividends. And it's with intentionality. I love this work. I'm here to share this passion with all of those that have carved out this time to be with us this evening, and understand that it is worth the time, and it's now. It's a sense of urgency. I can keep going.
I actually have a question for the whole group, and any of you can chime in here. But the real question is then, what is the relationship between innocence and emotional regulation? How did these kind of come together in a concept for how we support our children at school?
Is that for, I'm sorry.
Well,
Go ahead.
This is something that I wrote down when we were having our planning sessions with the Innocent Classroom team. And it just has really stuck with me, because I believe it gets right to that answer. So from the child's perspective, if I believe I can trust in the space and the relationship, then I can take the risks to learn and try these new skills. And you will still be here for me, even if I fail. And I just think about if all children had that gift, what a beautiful space we could create, and so much growth could come of that. So many potentials can be reached. So I'll turn it over to one of you now.
Yeah, no, thank you, Leah. I think that's a really, really beautiful quote from somebody in our planning meeting. But I think that's exactly right. It's kind of this space of, even just when you think about the different zones that we know we all go through, and we all have these different days and moments where we're feeling different ways. But it's the space of belief when we say that there is no good or bad zone. It's like this belief that when we say, no, I actually want you to tell me exactly how you're feeling or exactly how you're experiencing this. So the innocent child is, again, it's not the happiest child all the time. It's not a child that's, always smiling and always having the best day ever, but it is a child that can struggle at times and believe that they're not being condemned for some pre-written narrative, or they can even have a tough day or have a bad day, and they know that their relationship with you isn't in jeopardy, or that they're somehow affirming a lifelong destiny of sorts that they've been trying to run from or run towards based on how old the child is or how often they hear these guilty narratives. So yeah, it really becomes this space of belief in these really powerful initiatives that we want to have in our spaces as relates to social and emotional learning.
I want to add that it's important that the children that come to us, they are impacted by the society's, the guilt that are put on them. And I think they have, the adults have to be ready to do that work, to see them. And there's a skill that they learn about emotions, because students are going to be looking at you and really asking the question deep down, are you still going to be there? Are you still, and then you're going to get those students that are going to test. They're going to keep going because they want to get to a place where when it's said and done, I really need to know that you're there for me. And they want to know that, yes, they really truly can be themselves, that they really can experience these emotions without feeling judged, that you still care about them, that you still see them. And I think there's a practice in that. And I think educators really truly want to do that. I think creating that space where they can practice doing that, and they can unpack and see that child for who he or she is coming into that classroom every day, new mercies, new grace. And how do you build that up? It's hard to do by yourself, but collectively in conversations about zones of regulation, what that professional development brings to the space, what that professional development from Innocent Classroom brings into that space really gives an educator the tools to really be able to understand that emotions are real and need to be validated, because it's hard to not take it personal. It's hard to not take it personal. And so just that practice and that reframing the behaviors and the emotions, that it's a language that we need to unpack and interpret.
Principal Jones, I have a question for you that's more based in the art of implementation. Because we know that starting any, just getting some of this going can be really difficult work. And I'm wondering, how do you set intentions around beginning new transformative work in, either around social emotional learning or around, integrating the Innocent Classroom strategies into your school building?
Well, as a building leader coming in, you always want to assess the culture. You want to assess who am I working with? And knowing that I have a passion for children and seeing children in their innocence. And am I perfect? No. But where are our strengths as a culture in our schools? Where are some gaps in how we're seeing? Where's the consistency? And I think, equity. We want to make sure that all of our scholars have access and that we level the playing field. I think when I was at the Heights, there was the implementation of zones of regulation already in place. And so there was a common language that was shared. Students were well versed in articulating their tools, and you could see here in the hallway that asking, what zone are you in? What do you need to do to move in there? So it was those pieces. But there was another level of, you could still see that there was an opportunity for us to kind of move deeper even with the emotions. And so I was introduced to Innocent Classroom, but I've never been one to do a small group and let's see how it happens. I was pretty big with, if we're going to do this, we need to do this together, because to do something and not be able to have a shared language across our culture and our environment leaves some people out. It's not equal. So we made the commitment to do this as a whole school-wide, and we dedicated time to it. I recall that first conversation that Mr. Condie mentioned about what do they say about children? What does society say about our children, our Black and our brown, our marginalized scholars? And I just remember crying. I remember the list that we created, and I kept thinking, oh my gosh, if we could come up with a list that quick, how is that really playing out with our kids in our building? But our teachers embraced it, and we were able to 3 years in, but the beauty was in the practice, the actual practice of Innocent Classroom and unpacking it and really focusing in on relationships. I hope I'm answering your question. I have a tendency, because it is a passion, I tend to just kind of go deep and wide. So you'll have to kind of rein me in. But I will tell you, there have been some very prideful moments with the staff and implementing it, and the transformation of relationships with these tools. And I can add more as we get further into the discussion.
We have another great question here from Marina, who put a question into our chat, and I am going to direct this one to you, Julian. She asks, what do you say to the educators who feel that these principles are solely the job of parents and not the place for the schoolhouse? And that can be, developing some of these relationship skills or in terms of social emotional learning.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure, the response comes in similar ways, and like what it might be attempting to speak to when those different educators have their own pushback against these kind of conversations. It can always be so loaded, but in the Innocent Classroom work, we've heard it at times throughout our journey together with educators that whether or not it's their responsibility or their job to have an authentic relationship with a student, what we know more and more is the proof being, it demonstrates itself to some point where how successful are we with these lack of relationships? But that's not that compelling of a thing to say to an educator who's attempting to push back against the willingness to go on a journey to understand the humanity of a child. But I would want them to think about the experience of an individual child then in their space. And that's what we do in all of these conversations, particularly when you work with the full school, like Principal Jones was referencing. That doesn't mean everyone in that staff is on the same place of their journey towards belief or towards understanding and all of the complicated things that come with being more equitable and wanting to be more committed to social and emotional learning. An entire staff in a space has all sorts of different places in that journey, but we have to really think about the individual children in our spaces, in our classrooms. If you're an educator who's saying this is not your job, then I have to ask, well, what is your job? And what does that mean? And how have you been doing it as relates to a child who is missing all of the things that you do want to give them? Because I'm guessing whatever the answer is as like, you know, my job is to teach this skill or to teach this subject, all of that. We know none of that can happen if you don't understand the student in front of you, the individual child in front of you who's screaming for something. And that's what we know in our work. Our kids are asking for the world to see them in a certain way. And if we don't do that, or if we miss it, then we're also gonna miss the opportunity to give them all the other things that you do think is your job. But, you know, so that's like my, maybe not the best answer, but ultimately I think we know the individual children in our spaces, whether we think it's our job or not, need us to see them in certain ways. And if we want to get to all the other things that are our jobs, and it's imperative, and it's morally imperative, because we know over and over again, the children that we're predictably leaving behind are the ones who are our Black and brown children, who are our Indigenous children, who are our children who we can come up with all these different reasons of whose job it is and whose job it isn't or whose excuse it is, but they're coming to your class tomorrow and they need your care. So, I mean, I bet someone else can have a more compelling answer than that. But.
Honestly, that was a very compelling answer.
Thank you.
And it's scaffolds on top of each other. You have the relationship. Well, then you have this space to layer in the social emotional learning. You have the student who's regulated and able then to take in all that academic information that is ultimately what we're trying to, you know, test them and, you know, assess them on, get that information in their brain to turn into knowledge. But I feel like these are our first couple steps in making that information accessible to truly be transformative to knowledge and those gains.
I think this work is transformational in that our society, this is growing not just in the classroom too, it's wherever educators are seeing children. And how do we create a society in general that sees our kids' innocence? I think about, it's not just the parents, it's about all of us being intentional and seeing children innocently. And it's important. I agree with all that has been said.
I want to read a really a question from one of our attendees tonight, Ariel King. She asks, have you found the Innocent Classroom tools valuable for helping staff to overcome the barriers created by ableism when supporting students with disabilities, or I might say our neurodiverse learners? And you know, to add on a layer to this, you know, I particularly think about kids who are referred to by their behaviors first rather than their names first, or by their disability category or diagnosis before their name. And I wonder if I will have Julian pick up on this question.
Yeah, I was looking at that question too, and I was like, yeah, absolutely. And I think like it's one of those ones, you know, I'm sure as asking it, you were like, yep, I know, because it's, yes, 100%. The way that the narratives that are written about what it means to be who you are, whatever that might mean, whether it's a diagnosis or it's a a certain ability or not, or it's your skin color, your race, where you grew up, class, all of those things, the intersectionality of class or of power and privilege and oppression all intersect to define people constantly. So the only way to undermine that is an authentic connection with a human who's getting missed because of it. And that's, maybe that was way convoluted, but the only way to undermine the ways that our society are going to keep telling you to see someone a certain way, to believe certain things about them, to understand certain behaviors equal this, or certain diagnoses equal that, or certain places that you live equal this. It's really, we're constantly being defined by the mystical norm of it all. And that norm creates all these narratives that tell everyone who can't live up to that, the special mythical normative narrative that actually doesn't really capture very many people, period. But we know that the proximity or lack thereof to that mystical norm, where the narrative gets louder and more defining and telling us what to believe in. And yeah, so it's, ableism is so caught up in this. And we have such powerful conversations with educators who are committed to special education. And sometimes those same educators can fall into the traps that you mentioned, Emily, of the, like seeing kids for their diagnosis, or seeing kids for their behaviors, or seeing kids for something that's happened to them, or seeing kids for something that is, and we know that underneath all of those things, we need to understand what that means to the individual. And there's a humanity that's balled up underneath all of that. And we have to unknot the mess of narratives to have an authentic connection, to free up the impact of stereotype threat. So, I mean, I 100% believe and know that the work we do and all the principles of our work, and we started in this place of asking that question, what does society tell you about children of color? But we also, as we're building that list, right away, we call out how quickly people kind of predictably are, when you hear that question, you're thinking of Black boys, probably. The list of what society tells you about children of color, it starts as Black boys, and we need to bust that out more and more, because we know we're talking about more people. And ultimately we get to this place of all of our kids are being defined by narratives, but some of these narratives are so much louder and so much more powerful in the ways they control us than others that we need to run towards them. So yeah, it's so tied up in the way our children, who come with all sorts of different ways of being, are just trying to find out how they get to be human in our spaces.
The biggest piece is, one of the tools we used is the question, what is their good? Unpacking that and seeing them. And the tools did help our staff with looking at a scholar differently, and out of our own self, right? And so it was really student-centered, and it was individualized. And the program that I was principal of had an ASD program, a Fed Setting 3. And so it worked in all settings. The work wasn't for just one classroom or one group of kids. Like Mr. Condie said, it's for all of our children. And so, yes, we have found that the Innocent Classroom tools help our staff unpack the good and see the innocence of children, regardless of how they come to us and how they present.
I have a question for you, Leah. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how the zones of regulation sets up staff to alter or to kind of change their mindset in terms of behavior in general. How does the zone sort of address this in terms of building a climate?
Sure. I think teachers are tasked with this classroom management, and that is often one of the things they express is the hardest part of their job is this classroom management, and all the behaviors of the kids in their classroom. It can be aware on them. So when we think about integrating zones into a classroom, we're building student capacity. We're putting a language in place. We're giving a space that is safe to not only express how we're feeling, but also find these supports to regulate those feelings. And in layering the zones in, we now can have a dialogue with students. We can truly be teaching these skills. I say there was a mentality in some of the buildings I've worked in education where they were going to teach the kids a lesson. And it wasn't a self-regulation lesson. It was a punitive, disciplinary method that fingers were crossed that if they applied enough times, the students would truly behave some way differently. And we know the same kids were always subjected to those punitive measures time and time again, and they didn't have the skills to do anything different. So what the zones really works to shift this model away from putting this on the teacher's shoulders to regulate these children, to bring children into this equation, to help them truly build the skill. We're truly teaching them lessons to help them understand how they feel and be able to express those feelings, to allow that teacher caregiver to be a co-regulator and have that relationship there so they can support them through some of these feelings and stressors that come throughout their day. And then with time and practice exposure, our learners begin to build more self-regulation capacity, taking on more of this role and lessening that teacher's role for self-management as our students build their own lessening the teacher's role of classroom manager as kids build their role as self-managers.
Principal Jones, we have a great question here about, can you think of an example or give an example of, a student or a group of students or a moment that stands out to you where, the principles of social emotional learning through the zones really, and the mindset and relationship skills built with the innocent classroom were really just coming together in terms of, just an experience that you had at your school.
Yes, a few come to mind. There was a young person, and she was struggling. She was very new to our program, and there were some behaviors that were very explosive. They were disruptive. They were unsafe. And when we talked about, we used the zones of regulation. Again, she was new to the language, but it was taught in each one of our classrooms. And so our students eventually, we focused on those first 6 weeks about what is zones of regulation. And kids had cards with their colors that, if they were nonverbal, they could share. They had their own little toolkit. And she could use the colors to share how she was feeling. But she still struggled with the use of the tools. She could name the tools, but using the tools. And so we were also implementing innocent classroom. I recall, because of course, when a scholar is, kind of with those behaviors that I've described, it gets around quickly to staff, and how can we know who that child is? I recall the time when we were in innocent classroom, and each staff member identifies a scholar that they want to build a relationship, go deeper. And so we go through focusing on, focusing on a student, what is their good? What behaviors have we observed? And by the time we had that conversation, we never say a scholar's name in the space. We never say the scholar's name. But as we described and everyone was sharing information about the student and helping problem solve and giving opportunity, kind of sharing the kind of problem solving and trying to understand what that good was, we knew who we were talking about. And in that discussion, not only was it that there was opportunities for that scholar to have a relationship, not just with the classroom teacher, though that's where we were starting. That's where we got the case, not case study, but the scholar from. We saw that there were multiple places where we could create opportunities to feed that good. And so everybody was on board. And it was just a matter of time. And there's the video that you will even hear some of our, 3 of our people in our video talk about that situation where she just transformed, and it was to be safe. She wanted to be safe. And and it was trial and error, I will say, but the staff were committed to making the difference. What do we need to know? What does she need? But it was the most beautiful way of manifestation of zones of regulation, because then now she could regulate herself. She could actually move through the zones and regulate herself. But then she knew she was cared for and safe. I think it was cared for and safe. And so just that's one of my favorite examples of the two coming together.
Wow, for all of you special education teachers out there, think if we infuse this kind of thinking into our IEP meetings about students and planning for their goals and how we're going to meet them. So thank you for sharing that. I have a great question here, and I think I'm gonna bounce this one right back to you, Principal Jones, because it's about implementation. And the question is from Lauren, and she asks, do you recommend starting the zones of regulation and innocent classroom at the same time, or start with one and build upon the other?
Well, it happened to work that zones of regulation was already in place when I came to the program. And I assessed, where we were with our equity work. And Innocent Classroom was a wonderful pairing and the next level. And I say it as if it was that quick, but I don't do anything too quick. It was very intentional. It was very strategic. It took a lot. I had to make sure the staff was ready. And there were some things that were in place to get us ready. So whether or not one before the other, I've not been a proponent of introducing two at the same time. It's important that we get well versed in one, a real solid foundation before adding another layer, because then it's too much to juggle. But if it's something that you get your staff to the point where it's automatic, then introducing something that's going to complement it. I will also share that it was not just going through the professional development also. It was about what were we going to take from the experiences and really embed it into our processes and our systems. I needed staff to know that this was not a one-stop shop done. This wasn't once we get done, it's over. So we put that process of unpacking a child's good in our student assistant team process. We put it in our DeFors. We recreated our DeFors, the tools that we use for our PLC, where teachers, it was intentional that teachers, our educators that were on the staff of the Heights, we were going to use this process, that we were going to commit to this work. It was also in our child study. It got to the point, and this is every building leader's dream is, yes, I'm bringing it to you, but it's not mine alone. That it has to get to a point where it's what we do. It's now just what we do, how we talk about it. We talk about, I love my work with zones of regulation and Ms. Kuypers. And so taking it to the next level of, creating these visuals that our schedules, our walls had to show what it is we're doing. And so your question was one or the other. Told you I can talk about this forever. I can't really answer that, but I would say one, then the other.
I think one thing that you said, Principal Jones, that might guide that answer too, is you talked about assessing your staff and what are they ready for? And maybe they're ready for one more so than the other, and maybe more work needs to be done. And that's where I do talk about, it's okay to put the brakes on putting the zones of regulation in place. If your staff's not ready for it, and we need to shift the climate of our classrooms first, that's going to make the zones more successful down the road. So don't be afraid to dig in and do that work first on your equity work, your climate, your culture, because it will then be that step, that foundation that will really be layered in. And the language can be used together and really, I mean, it all weaves so well together.
Yeah. The biggest thing is that whatever it is, you want to make sure that staff are ready so that harm isn't caused in the process. They're already coming, and it's not to fix kids. It's not to fix kids, but we have to make sure that we are presenting in a way that we're not harming them, that we're not coming in with behaviors that affirm what society says about them. So we had to check ourselves and really be ready to commit to our own racial equity journey. And our leadership team was very instrumental in bridging that and building capacity throughout our whole 3 years of experience, specifically with Innocent Classrooms. So.
I think that everything that we have heard tonight just speaks to the power of the individual teacher, practitioner, grown up in a young person's life. And, the power that we have to really transform learning, safety, and support for the students, all the students and young people that come in and out of our doors and in and out of our lives. And so I really appreciate all of the examples, all of the experiences that you have shared. And we really thank all of our participants for taking their time out to be here tonight. I know it has been a really busy school year. You can see Leah's daughter has her thank you teachers sign up. It's teacher appreciation. We thank you so much for the work you do and for all of you teacher supporters out there, administrators and people who are just really making it happen for the young people who have needed all of us grown-ups more than ever this year. And so we hope that you are taking some time to care for yourselves and for the people in your life. And we appreciate you. This, like I said before, this video will be available for replay on Facebook Live and then shortly up on our YouTube channel for the Zones of Regulation. And I want to give a special thank you to Julian Conde from the Innocent Classroom and the whole team from Innocent Classroom, to Principal Jones from St. Paul Public Schools and everywhere else that she's doing her amazing work, and to Leah Kuypers and the rest of our team at the Zones of Regulation. So thank you for being here. We appreciate you, and definitely be in touch for more information about our programs. Have a great evening.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Have a good night.